Presley knew the truth about Elvis's marriage and stayed silent. There's a photograph from 1967 that most people glance past without thinking twice. Elvis and Priscilla on their wedding day, smiling for the cameras, the flashbulbs catching that famous face at the peak of his charm. But if you look just beyond the frame, just past the staged perfection of that Las Vegas ceremony, you'll find another face. Older, quieter, harder to read. Vernon Presley, standing where he always stood, close enough to see everything, far enough to never be the center of attention. His expression in that photograph isn't joy, it isn't pride. It's something else entirely, something guarded, something watchful. And if you understand who Vernon Presley really was, that look tells you more about Elvis's marriage than 100 interviews ever could. Vernon wasn't simply Elvis's father. He was the architect of the empire's daily machinery, the man who signed the checks and reviewed the contracts and knew exactly where every dollar went. When Elvis bought Graceland, it was Vernon who managed it. When Elvis hired someone new, Vernon approved them. When deals were negotiated, tours were scheduled, or problems needed quiet solutions, Vernon handled it all with the steady, unflappable efficiency of a man who had learned long ago that survival depended on staying useful. He had grown up poor in Tupelo, Mississippi, had served time in prison for a desperate check fraud scheme that nearly destroyed his family, and had watched his wife Gladys die in a way that shattered both him and his son. By the time Elvis stood at that altar in 1967, Vernon had rebuilt his entire existence around one singular purpose: protecting his son's success at all costs. That protection extended far beyond finances. Vernon understood the entertainment industry in ways that Elvis, wrapped up in the performance and the adoration, often didn't. He knew that scandal could end a career overnight. He knew that the wrong headline, the wrong photograph, the wrong whisper in the wrong ear could unravel everything they had built. And he knew, standing at that wedding, watching his son marry a 21-year-old woman who had been waiting for this moment since she was 14 years old, that this marriage carried risks Elvis hadn't fully considered. Priscilla was young and sheltered and deeply in love with an idea of Elvis that the real man could never consistently be. Elvis was restless and driven, and surrounded by people who enabled his every impulse. Vernon saw the collision coming long before anyone else admitted it was possible. What made Vernon's position so uniquely painful was the depth of his love for both of them. He genuinely cared for Priscilla. He had watched her grow up in Elvis's orbit, had seen her patience and devotion, had recognized in her the kind of steadiness that his own late wife Gladys had possessed. Vernon understood what Priscilla represented: a chance for Elvis to have something real, something grounding, something separate from the chaos of fame. And yet Vernon also knew his son. He knew the restlessness, the insatiable hunger for stimulation, the way Elvis could make someone feel like the center of the universe one moment and completely invisible the next. These weren't flaws Vernon could fix. They were simply who Elvis was. And so Vernon watched and waited and kept his observations to himself. Years later, long after the marriage had collapsed and Elvis had spiraled into darker places, people who worked closely with Vernon would recall a conversation that stayed with them. It happened sometime in the mid-1970s, after the divorce was final, and the tabloids had moved on to new scandals. Vernon was speaking quietly to an old associate, someone who had been around since the early days. The associate asked Vernon directly what had really happened between Elvis and Priscilla, expecting the usual deflection, the polite non-answer. Instead, Vernon paused for a long moment, his face heavy with something that looked almost like grief. And then he said something the associate never forgot. People think they know what happened between those two. They don't know the half of it, and I'm not going to be the one to tell them. Through every interview request, every biographer's inquiry, every family conversation that veered too close to the truth, Vernon maintained his silence. He took what he knew about Elvis's marriage, about the love and the failures and the private devastation on both sides, and he buried it deep where no journalist could reach. Some people called it loyalty, others called it complicity, but whatever you call it, one thing remains undeniable. Vernon Presley understood his son's marriage in ways the public never did. And the question that still haunts anyone who looks closely at this story is simple. What exactly did Vernon see behind those closed doors that he was so determined to protect? The wedding photographs told one story. The years that followed told another entirely. From the outside, Elvis and Priscilla Presley looked like American royalty settling into domestic bliss. The mansion, the daughter, the matching smiles at carefully orchestrated public appearances. But Vernon, who moved through Graceland's hallways with the quiet authority of a man who belonged there, saw what the cameras never captured. He saw the empty chairs at dinner tables when Elvis was on tour for months at a time. He saw Priscilla wandering the house like a ghost in her own home, surrounded by Elvis's entourage but utterly alone. He saw the distance growing between his son and daughter-in-law, not in dramatic confrontations, but in the slow accumulation of silence, of missed conversations, of two people occupying the same space without ever truly meeting. Elvis's schedule in those years was relentless in ways that would break most marriages under far less pressure. The Las Vegas residencies alone demanded months of performance, night after night. The same songs, the same crowds, the same isolation in hotel suites, surrounded by hired company. Between Vegas came the tours, the recording sessions, the obligations that never seemed to end. When Elvis finally came home to Graceland, he rarely arrived as a husband returning to his wife. He arrived as a performer still wired from the stage, surrounded by the Memphis Mafia, keeping hours that made normal conversation impossible. He slept until mid-afternoon. He stayed awake until dawn. He filled the house with noise and people and activity that somehow left Priscilla feeling more invisible than the silence ever had. Vernon witnessed all of it from his unique vantage point. He managed the finances, which meant he knew precisely where the money flowed and to whom. He approved the travel arrangements, which meant he understood the logistics of Elvis's life in ways that revealed patterns Priscilla might only have suspected. The gifts that appeared on credit card statements. The flights booked for companions whose names never made it into official records. The whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when certain people entered the room. Vernon was not naive. He had spent enough years navigating his son's world to recognize the shape of what was happening, even when no one spoke of it directly. The other women were not a secret within Elvis's inner circle. They were simply an unspoken reality that everyone acknowledged through careful silence. What made Vernon's position so agonizing was the impossibility of intervention. This was not a normal family where a father could pull his son aside and demand accountability. Elvis was the center of gravity around which everyone else orbited. His moods dictated the atmosphere of every room he entered. His approval determined who stayed in the inner circle and who was cast out without warning. Vernon had spent years learning how to navigate this dynamic, how to offer counsel without threatening, how to remain essential without becoming a target. Confronting Elvis directly about his marriage, about the infidelities, about the way he was slowly suffocating the woman who had given up everything to be with him, carried risks Vernon understood too well. He could speak and be ignored. He could push and be shut out entirely. Or he could remain silent and keep his place beside his son, hoping that somehow the situation would resolve itself. Years later, after one particularly tense visit to Graceland during the marriage's final gasping months, Vernon reportedly confided something to a longtime family friend. He said he didn't recognize his son anymore. Not the fame or the costumes or the stage persona. Those he had long accepted as necessary fictions. What troubled Vernon was something deeper. The man underneath was disappearing. Elvis was retreating into a version of himself that no one could reach. Not Priscilla, not Vernon, not anyone who had known him before the world discovered his name. The marriage, which should have anchored Elvis to something real, had instead become another weight dragging him beneath the surface. Vernon saw his son drowning in slow motion, and the most devastating part was knowing that nothing he said would be enough to pull him back. The year 1972 arrived, carrying a weight that would reshape everything Vernon had spent years trying to hold together. Priscilla had reached the end of what she could endure. Not dramatically, not with the explosive confrontation the tabloids would have loved to report, but with the quiet devastation of a woman who had finally accepted that loving Elvis Presley was not enough to save their marriage. When she told Elvis she was leaving, the reaction was not what anyone expected. The man who commanded stadiums, who made millions of people scream his name, who seemed untouchable in his fame, simply broke. Vernon was nearby when the news shattered his son's world. He watched Elvis crumble in ways the public would never witness, ways that no performance could mask, ways that revealed just how much Priscilla had meant to the man beneath the legend. In the aftermath of the separation and the divorce that followed, Vernon's role expanded beyond anything he had previously managed. He became the shield between Elvis and the chaos threatening to consume him. The legal arrangements required coordination with attorneys who understood that discretion was worth more than their hourly fees. The property divisions demanded careful negotiation to protect assets Elvis barely thought about in his grief. The custody agreements for Lisa Marie, still a young child caught between two parents whose love for her was the only thing they still fully shared, required delicacy that Vernon provided without complaint. He handled the press inquiries with practiced deflection, offering nothing that could become a headline, revealing nothing that might feed the tabloid machinery already circling his family like vultures. But beneath the logistics and the legal maneuvering, Vernon played a deeper role that no contract could define. He became the vessel for his son's pain. Elvis raged in those months, blamed everyone around him, wept with an intensity that frightened the people closest to him, and refused to accept that his own choices had contributed to the collapse. Vernon absorbed it all without pushing back. He listened to the accusations without correcting them. He stood steady while Elvis unleashed grief that had no productive outlet, understanding that his son needed someone to receive the weight he could not carry alone. It was not a comfortable role. It was not a role Vernon had ever wanted, but it was the role his son needed, and Vernon fulfilled it with the same quiet dedication he brought to everything else. What complicated Vernon's position was his genuine respect for Priscilla. He understood what she had sacrificed in ways that Elvis, wrapped in his own perspective, often failed to acknowledge. She had entered his world as a teenager, had surrendered her independence and identity to become the wife of the most famous man in America, and had endured years of loneliness that would have destroyed someone with less resolve. When the marriage ended, Vernon did not vilify her publicly or privately. He maintained a careful distance that honored what she had meant to his son, while respecting the boundaries the divorce required. Some who knew Vernon well suspected that he sympathized with Priscilla more than he ever admitted. She had done what Vernon himself could never do. She had set a boundary with Elvis and walked away. In her courage, Vernon perhaps saw a reflection of the strength he wished he possessed. As the years passed and the divorce settled into history, Vernon's silence on the subject only deepened. Journalists approached him with questions designed to extract controversy. Biographers pressed for details that would have sold thousands of books. Even family members, curious about what had really happened behind those closed doors, found themselves redirected with vague responses about love being complicated and private matters deserving privacy. Vernon never contradicted Elvis's version of events, never offered his own interpretation, never revealed the private conversations or the moments of vulnerability that might have reshaped public understanding. He chose protection over truth, loyalty over legacy. And by the time Elvis died in 1977, the full story of the marriage remained locked inside the one man who had witnessed it from beginning to end. Vernon took those secrets with him, not because he didn't care about truth, but because he understood that some truths belong only to the people who lived them. Understanding Vernon Presley's silence requires understanding the kind of loyalty that most people never have to test. This was not the casual allegiance of a business partner or the professional discretion of a hired manager. This was something far deeper, forged in poverty and prison and the shared grief of losing Gladys, the woman who had held their small family together through impossible circumstances. Vernon had watched his son transform from a shy boy in Tupelo into the most recognizable human being on the planet. He had witnessed that transformation consume everything in its path, including the marriages and relationships and quiet moments that normal people take for granted. By the time Elvis and Priscilla's marriage collapsed, Vernon had spent decades protecting something larger than any single relationship. He was protecting the idea of Elvis itself, the mythology that had rescued their family from obscurity and given them everything they possessed. To threaten that idea, even with truth, was unthinkable for Vernon. He understood what the public wanted from Elvis, the fantasy of the charming rebel, the devoted performer, the man who could make anyone feel special with a single glance. Revealing the complications of Elvis's marriage, the infidelities and the loneliness and the ways both partners had failed each other would have introduced shades of gray into a story the world preferred in black and white. Vernon recognized that truth, in this context, was not a gift. It was a weapon capable of wounding his son's legacy in ways that could never be repaired. And so he chose silence, not from weakness or cowardice, but from a love so consuming that it overrode every other consideration, including his own need to be understood. The scope of what Vernon knew extended far beyond any single incident or revelation. He understood the full architecture of the marriage's failure, the small betrayals and the large ones, the moments when reconciliation seemed possible, and the moments when the distance became permanent. He knew about the other women, not as rumors but as logistical realities he had helped manage through financial oversight and travel arrangements. He knew about Priscilla's isolation, the way she had been sidelined in her own home, made to feel like an accessory rather than a partner. But he also knew about the tenderness that existed between them, the genuine love that had drawn them together, and the genuine grief that accompanied its ending. Vernon held these contradictions without attempting to resolve them because he understood that the truth about Elvis and Priscilla could never be reduced to a simple narrative. When Vernon died in 1979, just 2 years after his son, those contradictions died with him. Biographers rushed to fill the void with speculation and second-hand accounts. Tabloids continued their endless appetite for scandal, manufacturing stories from fragments and innuendo. Priscilla eventually published her own memoir, offering her perspective on a marriage that had defined and nearly destroyed her. Her version became the dominant narrative by default, not because it was incomplete, but because it was the only comprehensive account available. Vernon's perspective, the view from the one person who had witnessed everything without being directly consumed by it, vanished into history. The questions he could have answered, the context he could have provided, the humanity he could have restored to a story, often reduced to celebrity gossip, all of it was lost because Vernon chose silence over revelation. Perhaps that was the greatest gift Vernon ever gave his son. Not protection from scandal, though he provided that too, but something more profound. He gave Elvis the right to be remembered as Elvis wanted to be remembered, imperfect but beloved, troubled but triumphant, a man whose music mattered more than his mistakes. Vernon could have reshaped that legacy with a single interview, a single moment of candor that would have echoed through every biography written afterward. He chose instead to let the silence speak for itself, to carry his knowledge to the grave rather than burden the world with complications it might not have been ready to receive. Whether you view that choice as noble sacrifice or tragic missed opportunity depends entirely on what you believe truth owes to the people it concerns. Vernon made his decision, and he never once looked back. What do you think Vernon knew that he never shared? Was his silence the ultimate act of love, or a truth the world deserved to hear? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if these untold stories resonate with you, subscribe now. There is so much more hidden inside the Elvis legacy waiting to be uncovered.
Farewell, Royal High School, we'll remember you.
On the evening of August 15th, 2022, something extraordinary was happening at Graceland. Thousands of Elvis Presley fans had begun gathering outside those famous gates, clutching candles and photographs, preparing to honor the king on the 45th anniversary of his death. They came from every corner of the world to sing his songs, to weep together, to remember the man who changed music forever. But while those devoted fans were lighting their candles and whispering prayers, just miles away, a woman named Nancy Rooks was taking her final breath. She was 84 years old. And she died carrying secrets that would have made every single person at that vigil drop their candles in disbelief. The timing of her death feels almost impossible to accept as coincidence. One day before the anniversary. One day before the world would once again mourn Elvis Presley, as if fate itself had written the ending to her story, ensuring that Nancy Rooks would exit this world just as the spotlight returned to the man she had served, protected, and ultimately helped cover up the truth about. Because that is exactly what Nancy Rooks did. She helped erase the evidence of what really happened to Elvis Presley on August 16, 1977. And for 45 years, she carried that burden in silence. Most people have never heard her name. The Memphis Mafia got the interviews, the girlfriends got the book deals, the family controlled the narrative, but Nancy Rooks was there in ways none of them ever were. She worked at Graceland for 15 years as Elvis Presley's personal maid and cook. Her shift ran from 5 in the evening until 1 in the morning, though she often stayed until 3. She prepared every meal he ate during those hours. She laid out his clothes, she cleaned his most private spaces, she saw him at his best and at his absolute worst. And unlike the bodyguards who traded stories for cash or the girlfriends who wrote tell-all memoirs within years of his death, Nancy kept her mouth shut for decades. Think about what that means. She watched the most famous man on earth eat himself into oblivion. She witnessed the pill bottles multiply on his nightstand. She heard the arguments echo through those mansion walls. She saw the loneliness that fame could never fill. And she said nothing, not because she did not care, but because she cared too much. Nancy Rooks loved Elvis Presley in a way that was pure and uncomplicated. She was not trying to marry him. She was not trying to manage him. She was not trying to profit from him. She simply took care of him. And when he died, she did what she believed he would have wanted. She protected him. When Ginger Alden's panicked voice came through that telephone on August 16, 1977, Nancy was the one who answered. She was alone. No other staff members were immediately available to respond. So Nancy made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She went upstairs herself. She walked into that bathroom. And she saw the king of rock and roll lying dead on the floor. What happened next has been debated, investigated, and speculated about for nearly half a century. But Nancy Rooks knew the truth because she was part of it. In the chaos that followed as paramedics rushed Elvis to Baptist Memorial Hospital, Nancy and Elvis's aunt, Delta May, did something that would baffle investigators for years. They cleaned everything. They removed pills. They removed needles. They changed his sheets. They scrubbed that bathroom until it gleamed. By the time police returned to Graceland, the scene was so pristine that officials could not understand what had happened. There was no evidence left to examine, no clues to follow. Just an immaculate bedroom and a locked door. Aunt Delta kept the only key to the upstairs. And for years, people wondered why Elvis's private quarters became so completely inaccessible. Nancy finally provided the answer. They had erased the scene. They had protected the king from whatever ugly truth might have emerged from that bathroom floor. This is the woman whose story has never been fully told, not because she refused to tell it, but because the world was not ready to hear it. Nancy Rooks was not famous. She was not glamorous. She was a black woman working in the segregated South during an era when people like her were expected to remain invisible. But Elvis Presley did not see her that way. He saw her as family. He trusted her with his loneliness, his secrets, and ultimately his legacy. But before Nancy ever set foot in Graceland, fate had already chosen her. On a dusty Memphis street corner decades earlier, she watched a barefoot boy play guitar for spare change. She had no idea that boy would become the most famous man in the world. And she had no idea she would one day hold his secrets in her hands. The late 1940s in Memphis were a different world. Segregation ruled every corner of daily life. Streets had invisible lines that everyone understood but no one spoke about. And on Alabama Street, a young girl named Nancy was walking to the store when she noticed something unusual. A crowd of children had gathered in the middle of the road, blocking traffic and causing a commotion. Curious, she moved closer to see what had captured their attention so completely. At the center of that crowd stood a boy who could not have been more than a teenager. He was barefoot. His overalls hung loose on his skinny frame, one strap fastened properly, while the other dangled forgotten against his chest. He had a guitar in his hands, and he was playing it like his life depended on every note. The children surrounding him were mesmerized. They had stopped whatever they were doing just to listen to this strange barefoot boy make music on a street corner. Nancy watched him for a while. There was something about the way he played, something raw and hungry and completely unself-conscious. He was not performing for fame or money. He was simply playing because music lived inside him and needed to escape. She did not know his name. She did not speak to him. She just watched, absorbed the moment, and then continued on her way to the store. That barefoot boy became a memory she filed away and rarely thought about again. Life moved forward. Years passed. The world changed around her. 2 decades later, in May of 1967, Nancy was working for a temporary employment agency in Memphis. It was not glamorous work, but it paid the bills and kept food on the table. One afternoon, the agency called her with an urgent request. A maid had called in sick at a mansion called Graceland, and they needed someone to fill in immediately. Nancy had heard of Graceland, of course. Everyone in Memphis knew about the estate where Elvis Presley lived, but she had never been inside. She had never seen the king up close. She accepted the assignment and drove out to the mansion, expecting nothing more than a single day of work. The house itself was overwhelming. Crystal chandeliers, plush carpets, gold records lining the walls. Nancy moved through the rooms carefully, dusting and cleaning as instructed, trying not to touch anything too precious. Then she came across a photograph sitting on a shelf. It showed a young boy, skinny and bright-eyed, with that unmistakable Southern poverty clinging to his clothes. Something about the image made her stop. She stared at it for a long moment, and then the recognition hit her like a thunderbolt. That was the barefoot boy from Alabama Street, the one with the loose overall strap and the guitar, the one who had stopped traffic with nothing but raw talent and desperate hunger. Elvis Presley had been that boy, and Nancy had watched him play 20 years before she ever knew his name. The temporary job became permanent. Nancy Rooks joined the Graceland staff and remained there for the next 15 years. But unlike the bodyguards and managers who surrounded Elvis, Nancy occupied a different space entirely. She was not there to protect his image or negotiate his contracts. She was there to feed him, clothe him, and keep his private world running smoothly. And in doing so, she became something Elvis desperately needed but rarely found: a genuine friend. Elvis would slip $100 bills into her pocket with a quiet smile, telling her not to mention it to anyone. When his girlfriends went shopping and the mansion fell silent, he would call Nancy into his private quarters just to talk. Sometimes they sang hymns together, their voices blending in that empty room, while the king of rock and roll admitted he simply got lonesome. He needed someone who wanted nothing from him except his company. Nancy provided that rare gift freely. But for 15 years, Nancy also watched Elvis Presley slowly destroy himself. She prepared the massive meals he demanded. She noticed the pill bottles accumulating. She witnessed the mood swings growing more extreme. She saw a man trapped by his own legend, suffocating inside a golden cage that everyone else envied. Nothing could prepare her for August 16, 1977. The day she would answer a phone call that changed everything and make a decision that would haunt her until her final breath. August 16, 1977 began like any other summer day at Graceland. The Memphis heat pressed down on the mansion like a heavy blanket, and inside those walls, tension was building towards something no one could have predicted. When Nancy Rooks arrived for her evening shift, the staff members she encountered wore expressions that told her everything she needed to know. Elvis had been in a terrible mood all day. Something was very wrong. The night before had been restless for Elvis. Sleep would not come no matter how many pills he swallowed. He had gone out on motorcycle rides through the Graceland grounds, burning off anxious energy that seemed to have no source and no end. At some point during those dark hours, he had attempted to rent an entire movie theater for a private screening, one of his favorite escapes from the prison of his own fame. But the arrangements fell through. Nothing was going right. The walls were closing in on the king, and everyone around him could feel it. Then there was Ginger. Elvis and his young fiancée had been arguing throughout the day with an intensity that alarmed the staff. The subject was his upcoming tour and whether Ginger would accompany him. She had hesitations. He had demands. Their voices rose and fell behind closed doors while household employees exchanged nervous glances and tried to stay out of the crossfire. At one point, staff members walked in on Elvis and Ginger arguing forcefully in Lisa Marie's bedroom during the early morning hours. The fight was serious enough that people remembered it decades later. This detail matters because it directly contradicts what Ginger Alden would later tell the world. In her version of events, August 16th was a day filled with positivity and wedding planning. She painted a picture of domestic bliss interrupted by sudden tragedy. But Nancy was there. She heard the arguments. She saw the tension crackling through the air like electricity before a storm. The final day of Elvis Presley's life was not peaceful. It was a battlefield. Then came the phone call that changed everything. Nancy was working when the telephone rang that afternoon. Ginger Alden's voice came through the line, desperate and panicked, begging for someone to come upstairs immediately. Nancy looked around and realized she was alone. No other staff members were available to respond. The decision fell entirely on her shoulders, and she made it without hesitation. She went upstairs herself to see what was wrong. What Nancy discovered in that bathroom would be seared into her memory forever. The king of rock and roll lay motionless on the floor. His body had failed him at last, surrendering to years of abuse and neglect that no amount of fame could protect him from. Elvis Presley was dead. And Nancy Rooks was standing over him, one of the last people to see the king before the world found out. In the chaos that followed, paramedics rushed Elvis to Baptist Memorial Hospital in a desperate attempt to revive him. But while medical professionals fought a battle they had already lost, something else was happening back at Graceland, something that would baffle investigators for decades. Nancy and Elvis's aunt Delta Mae made a choice that would haunt both of them for the rest of their lives. They cleaned everything. Pills disappeared from nightstands. Needles vanished from drawers. Sheets were stripped from the bed and replaced with fresh linens. The bathroom where Elvis had taken his final breath was scrubbed until it sparkled. By the time police and emergency medical technicians returned to Graceland to investigate, they found a scene so pristine it made no sense. Where was the evidence of a man in medical crisis? Where were the prescription bottles? Where were the signs of struggle or distress? Everything had been erased. Aunt Delta immediately locked off the entire upstairs area and kept the only key. For years, researchers and investigators wondered why Elvis's private quarters became so mysteriously inaccessible. Nancy finally provided the answer. They had protected Elvis the only way they knew how. They had erased the ugly truth so the world would remember a king instead of a cautionary tale. But was it protection? Or was it something else entirely? Nancy helped cover up the truth about Elvis Presley's death. The question that haunted her was simple. Did she save his legacy, or doom us all to never know what really killed the king? After Elvis died, most people would have walked away from Graceland forever. The memories would have been too painful, the ghosts too loud. But Nancy Rooks stayed. She remained on staff for another 11 years, continuing to clean the same rooms where she had once served the king himself. She watched the mansion transform from a private sanctuary into something Elvis would have despised: a tourist attraction. When Graceland opened its doors to the public in June 1982, Nancy helped manage the transition. She guided the process of preparing Elvis's home for strangers to walk through, knowing full well that the man she had loved like family never wanted this. Elvis had been fiercely protective of his privacy. He had built those walls to keep the world out. And now the world was buying tickets to peek inside. But something strange began happening after Elvis died. Something Nancy could not explain with logic or reason. Doors throughout the mansion would slam shut with tremendous force when nobody was anywhere near them. Lights in the trophy room would flicker on and off while Nancy cleaned alone at night. Objects would shift positions between her visits as if invisible hands had rearranged them. At first, she dismissed these occurrences as coincidence or exhaustion playing tricks on her mind. But the incidents kept happening with a consistency that defied explanation. Nancy began talking to whatever presence lingered in those halls. She would scold the spirit playfully when the lights flickered, telling Elvis to leave them alone so she could finish her work. One particular night, she had dozed off briefly in the trophy room during her cleaning shift. Suddenly, she felt a gentle force nudging her awake, as if someone were softly pushing her shoulder to rouse her back to consciousness. When her eyes opened, nobody was there. But Nancy had no doubt about what had happened. Elvis himself had woken her up, still trying to keep his home running smoothly even from beyond the grave. She believed Elvis was angry about Graceland becoming a public spectacle. The door-slamming incidents felt like expressions of rage to her. His spirit was making its displeasure known in the only way it could. The king did not rest peacefully because his sanctuary had been invaded by the very crowds he spent his life hiding from. Nancy was not the only one who could not find peace at Graceland after Elvis died. Lisa Marie, the little girl who had once loved growing up in that mansion, underwent a profound transformation. She could no longer bear spending nights in the home where her father had died. Instead of sleeping at Graceland when she visited, she would stay at her cousin Patsy's house nearby. Nancy noticed the change immediately. The joyful child who had once filled those halls with laughter now carried a heaviness that never fully lifted. Knowing her father had taken his last breath upstairs made the entire house feel like a tomb. During her later years, Nancy transformed herself in ways nobody expected. The woman who had started as a substitute maid became a published author. Her first book, The Maid, the Man, and the Fans, came out in 1984. The Presley family cookbook followed in 1990, co-authored with Elvis's uncle Vester. But her final book, Inside Graceland, Elvis's Maid Remembers, published in 2005, contained revelations she had never shared before. Each book peeled back another layer of secrecy. Each publication revealed details she had previously guarded fiercely. Why did she wait 21 years between her first book and her most revealing one? Perhaps she needed time to process the trauma of everything she witnessed. Perhaps she felt obligated to protect people who were still alive in 1984 but had since passed on. Or perhaps she simply reached an age where the truth mattered more than discretion. Linda Thompson, one of Elvis's former girlfriends, maintained a friendship with Nancy for 45 years after Elvis died. She described Nancy as kind, responsible, modest, and powerful. That final word carried special weight. Nancy Rooks was a black woman in the segregated South who held more influence over Elvis Presley's daily life than most of the wealthy white men surrounding him. Her grandson, Jesse Cheatham, who became a Tennessee state representative, credited Nancy with teaching him that we do not have to end where we start. Nancy started as a temporary maid answering a last-minute phone call. She ended as the keeper of secrets that died with her on August 15, 2022, one day before the world remembered Elvis, right on time for fate to write its final chapter. Nancy Rooks gave us the closest thing to truth we will ever have about what happened at Graceland. If her story moved you, honor her legacy by subscribing to this channel for more untold secrets they never wanted you to know. Hit the like button and share this video so the truth keeps spreading.
Good morning.
Good morning to you.
You've written a memoir about life with Elvis. This is really about life after Elvis. Why was this the story you wanted to tell?
Oh my gosh. I think, living the life with Elvis Presley, and of course, I was his wife, and I, learned a lot from him about life, about business, about caring, and he was very, very special in every way.
At 80, Priscilla Presley finally reveals the real reason she never remarried after Elvis. Priscilla Presley hasn't walked down the aisle in over 50 years. And until now, everyone assumed it was because no man could ever replace Elvis. They were dead wrong. For decades, the world has clung to this beautiful, tragic narrative. The devoted ex-wife. The woman who loved so deeply, so completely, that she simply couldn't fathom giving her heart to another man. It's the kind of story that sells magazines and fills documentary hours. It's romantic. It's poetic. And according to Priscilla herself, it's a complete fabrication. At 80 years old, Priscilla Presley is finally done pretending. She's done smiling through interviews and letting people project their fantasies onto her life. And what she's revealed isn't a love story. It's something far more complicated, far more painful, and far more human than any fairy tale the public has been sold. You see, the assumption has always been that Priscilla remained single because Elvis set an impossible standard. That every man who came after him was simply measured against the king and found wanting. It's a flattering story for Elvis. It preserves his legacy as not just the greatest entertainer of his generation, but as the greatest love of Priscilla's life. But here's what nobody ever stopped to question. What if staying single had nothing to do with Elvis being irreplaceable? What if it had everything to do with what Elvis took from her that she could never get back? To understand Priscilla's truth, you need to forget everything you think you know about their romance. Forget the wedding photos. Forget the glamorous couple waving to crowds. Forget the image of young love blooming in the spotlight. Because behind that image was something the public wasn't supposed to see. A systematic dismantling of a young girl's identity, executed so thoroughly that by the time Priscilla became a woman, she didn't know who she was anymore. Elvis didn't fall in love with Priscilla Presley. He selected her. And there's a crucial difference between those two things. When they met, Priscilla was 14 years old. 14. She was a ninth grader living on a military base in Germany, and Elvis was already the most famous man in America. He was 24, worldly, powerful, and completely in control of the dynamic from the very first moment. This wasn't a meeting of equals. This wasn't even a meeting of adults. This was a grown man identifying a child he could shape into exactly what he wanted. And shape her he did. Over the years that followed, Elvis didn't just date Priscilla. He constructed her. He dictated how she wore her hair. He chose her makeup, her clothes, her entire aesthetic. The jet black hair that became her signature, that was Elvis's preference, not hers. The heavy eyeliner, the specific way she presented herself to the world, Elvis designed that look. He literally created her image from scratch, molding a teenage girl into his personal vision of the perfect woman. And Priscilla, young and overwhelmed and desperately in love, let him do it. She didn't just let him, she believed it was love. But here's where the story takes its darker turn. When you allow someone to build your entire identity, something terrifying happens when that person is gone. You don't just miss them, you don't just grieve them, you become hollow. Because the person you were only existed in relation to them. Without them, you're not heartbroken, you're erased. This is what Priscilla has carried for 50 years. Not the ache of missing a great love, but the existential crisis of not knowing who she is without him. Every relationship she attempted after Elvis wasn't sabotaged by his memory. It was sabotaged by her inability to show up as a complete person. How can you give yourself to someone when you don't possess a self to give? The men who came after Elvis didn't fail because they weren't enough. They failed because Priscilla wasn't whole. And that's not her fault. That's the result of being handed to a powerful man when you're still a child and being shaped into an accessory rather than a partner. At 80, Priscilla looks back with a clarity that took decades to achieve. She understands now what she couldn't articulate at 25 or 35 or even 50. The reason she never remarried isn't because Elvis was the love of her life. It's because Elvis made sure he was her entire life. And breaking free from that, truly breaking free, has been the work of a lifetime. But to understand why Priscilla has spent 5 decades sleeping alone, you need to understand what really happened inside Graceland's walls. And trust me, it's not what the documentaries show you. Graceland. The name conjures images of rock and roll royalty, gold records lining the walls, the famous jungle room, tourists from around the world making pilgrimages to stand where the king once stood. But for Priscilla Presley, Graceland wasn't a palace. It was a gilded cage, and the bars were invisible to everyone except the woman trapped inside. When Priscilla moved into Graceland as a teenager, she entered a world completely controlled by Elvis. Every aspect of her existence fell under his authority. She couldn't leave the property without permission. She couldn't maintain friendships he didn't approve of. Her entire social world shrank down to Elvis, his entourage, and the staff who ran the estate. For a young woman still developing her sense of self, this isolation was catastrophic. But at the time, Priscilla didn't recognize it as isolation. She recognized it as love. Elvis had rules, strict rules, and Priscilla followed every single one of them because she believed that's what devoted partners did. She woke when he wanted her to wake, which often meant sleeping through the day and living through the night to match his schedule. She dressed how he wanted her to dress. She styled herself according to his exact specifications, the heavy makeup, the towering hair, the specific outfits that made her look less like a young woman and more like a porcelain doll designed for display. Priscilla became Elvis's living artwork, his creation, his possession, and the control extended far beyond appearance. Elvis monitored her behavior obsessively. He decided which conversations were appropriate. He determined which interests she could pursue. When Priscilla expressed a desire to take classes or develop skills outside the home, Elvis discouraged it. He wanted her available. He wanted her waiting. He wanted her ready whenever he needed her, which meant she couldn't build a life that existed independently of him. Her world became his world, and his world was all-consuming. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of this control was how Elvis justified it. He framed his possessiveness as protection. He positioned his dominance as devotion. He made Priscilla believe that his obsessive oversight meant he cherished her more than anything, and she bought it completely. Why wouldn't she? She was a teenager when this began. She had no framework for recognizing manipulation. She only knew that the most famous man on the planet had chosen her, and she would do anything to keep his love. The psychological impact of this dynamic cannot be overstated. When your identity is constructed by someone else, you don't develop the internal architecture that makes you whole. You become dependent on that person not just emotionally but existentially. Priscilla has admitted in recent years that when she finally left Elvis, she felt completely lost. Not heartbroken in the traditional sense, lost. She didn't know her own preferences. She didn't know her own opinions. She didn't know who Priscilla was when she wasn't being Elvis's Priscilla. This is the wound that never fully healed. This is the damage that made every subsequent relationship feel impossible. How do you build intimacy with a new partner when you don't have a stable self to offer them? How do you trust someone with your heart when you're not even sure what your heart wants? Priscilla spent years after her divorce simply trying to discover her own identity. The woman the world saw as Elvis's glamorous ex-wife was actually a person desperately searching for herself underneath decades of conditioning. And through all of this, there was another layer of pain that Priscilla carried silently: the other women. Elvis never hid his infidelities particularly well. The affairs were constant, the betrayals were endless, and Priscilla knew about virtually all of them. She watched the man who controlled her every move give himself freely to others while demanding absolute loyalty from her. The hypocrisy was staggering, the emotional toll was immense, but what Priscilla did about those affairs, how she responded to years of public humiliation while trapped in a gilded prison, that's where the real secret of her story begins to emerge. After Elvis, Priscilla didn't retreat into solitude. She tried to move on. She genuinely attempted to build new relationships, to find love again, to create a life that wasn't defined by a dead legend. But every single time, something went wrong. And the pattern was always devastatingly similar. Every man who got close to Priscilla eventually felt like they were competing with a ghost, and the ghost always won. It started with Mike Stone, the karate instructor who became Priscilla's escape route from her marriage. Their affair was the catalyst that finally gave her the courage to leave Elvis. For a brief moment, Mike represented freedom. He represented choice. He represented the first decision Priscilla had made entirely for herself since she was 14 years old. But even that relationship couldn't survive the gravitational pull of Elvis's memory. Once the divorce was final, once Elvis died just 5 years later, Mike Stone became a footnote, a transitional figure, the man who helped her leave but couldn't help her stay gone. Then came Michael Edwards, a handsome actor who seemed like he could be the real thing. Their relationship lasted years. It appeared serious. But Michael would later write about the experience, describing the impossible dynamic of dating Priscilla Presley. Elvis was everywhere, in the house, in the conversations, in the expectations, in the way Priscilla carried herself and the identity she couldn't shake. Michael wasn't dating a woman, he was dating a shrine, and eventually even he couldn't pretend otherwise. But the most revealing relationship came next. Marco Garibaldi entered Priscilla's life and stayed for 22 years. 22 years. They had a son together, Navarone. They built a life together. By every reasonable measure, they were a committed couple in everything but legal status. And that's precisely the point. Despite over 2 decades together, despite raising a child as partners, Priscilla never married Marco. She refused. Think about that for a moment. A 22-year relationship, a shared child, a life intertwined in every meaningful way. And still, Priscilla couldn't bring herself to walk down an aisle again. When pressed about it over the years, she offered various explanations. She valued her independence. She didn't need a piece of paper. Marriage wasn't necessary for commitment. But beneath those surface answers lay something much deeper and much more painful. For Priscilla, marriage wasn't just a legal arrangement. Marriage was ownership. Marriage was the loss of self she experienced at Graceland. Marriage was becoming someone else's creation rather than her own person. The word wife didn't represent partnership to her. It represented the girl she used to be, the girl who disappeared inside Elvis's world and nearly never found her way out. How could she risk becoming that girl again? How could she sign a document that symbolized everything she had fought so hard to escape? Marco Garibaldi wasn't competing with Elvis's legacy. He was competing with Priscilla's trauma. And that's a battle no man could win, no matter how patient, no matter how loving, no matter how many years he dedicated to the relationship. The damage had been done decades before Marco ever entered the picture. He was simply living with the consequences of wounds he didn't inflict. This pattern repeated with every man who came close. Priscilla wanted love. She genuinely did. But accepting love fully would have required releasing the armor she had built around herself. It would have meant trusting someone with an identity that still felt fragile after all those years. And she couldn't do it. The risk was too great. The memories were too vivid. The fear of losing herself again was stronger than the desire for companionship. So the men came and went. Some lasted months, some lasted decades. But none of them got all of her. None of them received the commitment that the world assumed she reserved only for Elvis. The truth was far more complicated than eternal devotion to a dead king. The truth was a woman so damaged by her first experience of marriage that she could never fully embrace another. But the most devastating revelation Priscilla has made at 80 isn't about the men who failed. It's about what she finally understood about herself. And it changes everything. At 80 years old, Priscilla Presley sat down and said something that nobody expected to hear. Not the media, not the fans, not even those who thought they understood her story. She looked back at 5 decades of being alone and finally spoke her truth. I didn't avoid marriage because I loved Elvis too much. I avoided it because I finally loved myself enough. Let that sink in for a moment. For 50 years, the world constructed a narrative around Priscilla Presley that cast her as the eternal romantic. The woman so devoted to one man that she could never accept another. It was beautiful. It was tragic. It was completely wrong. The real story isn't about devotion to Elvis. It's about Priscilla's devotion to herself. A devotion that took decades to develop and cost her more than most people will ever understand. When Priscilla left Graceland, she wasn't just leaving a marriage. She was leaving the only identity she had ever known. Everything about her, from the way she looked to the way she thought, had been shaped by Elvis. She was his creation in the most literal sense. And when that relationship ended, she faced a terrifying question that most people never have to confront. Who am I when I'm not someone else's projection? The years that followed were a slow and painful reconstruction. Priscilla had to discover her own preferences for the first time in her adult life. She had to learn what she actually liked, not what Elvis told her to like. She had to figure out what she believed, what she valued, what she wanted from her remaining years on this planet. It was work that happened in private, away from the cameras and the tabloids and the endless public fascination with her famous last name. And somewhere along that journey, Priscilla made a decision. She decided that she would never again allow herself to be absorbed into someone else's identity. She would never again become a supporting character in a man's story. She would never sign a marriage certificate that might symbolically transfer ownership of her newly discovered self. This wasn't bitterness. This wasn't fear. This was the most profound act of self-preservation she had ever committed. In recent interviews and in her memoir work, Priscilla has spoken with remarkable clarity about this transformation. She describes her younger self with compassion but also with clear-eyed honesty. That girl didn't know any better. That girl was handed to a powerful man before she could develop the tools to protect herself. But the woman she became, the woman who emerged from decades of inner work, that woman understood something crucial. Marriage had never been a partnership for her. It had been an erasure, and she refused to be erased again. This is why Marco Garibaldi never got a wedding ring despite 22 years together. This is why every man who came close eventually hit an invisible wall. Priscilla wasn't withholding commitment because she was damaged. She was protecting something sacred, something she had fought too hard to find. Her sense of self had been stolen from her once. She wasn't going to let it happen twice, no matter how kind the man, no matter how genuine the love, but freedom always comes with a price. And Priscilla has paid hers in ways that break your heart if you look closely enough. The recent battle over Lisa Marie's estate has put her at odds with her own granddaughter. The family she fought to build after Elvis has fractured in painful and public ways. Even now, even at 80, Elvis's shadow looms over everything. His legacy, his memory, his continued hold on the Presley family narrative. Priscilla escaped him in life, but she has never fully escaped him in legacy. And perhaps that's the most bittersweet part of her truth. Priscilla won her freedom. She reclaimed her identity. She built a self that belongs to her alone. But she did it in a world that still sees her primarily as Elvis's ex-wife, a world that still measures her value by her proximity to a man who died nearly 50 years ago. She fought so hard to become her own person, and yet the first line of every article, every introduction, every obituary that will one day be written will mention his name before hers. Still, Priscilla seems to have made peace with this contradiction. At 80, there's a calmness in how she tells her story, a resolution that wasn't there in earlier decades. She knows who she is now. She knows why she made the choices she made, and she no longer needs the world to understand. Priscilla Presley was given to Elvis Presley when she was still a child. She spent a decade becoming his creation, and she spent the next 50 years remembering who she was before he ever found her. Some people think she never remarried because Elvis haunted her, but the truth is far more powerful. She never remarried because she finally stopped being haunted, and that might be the most courageous thing she's ever done. If this story changed how you see Priscilla, drop a comment below. I want to know your thoughts. Did she make the right choice? And if you want more untold stories that reveal what really happens behind the fame, subscribe now and hit that notification bell. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. For 47 years, Priscilla Presley kept her mouth shut. She sat through thousands of interviews, smiled through endless documentaries, and watched as the world turned her ex-husband into a myth made of rhinestones and tragedy. She could have spoken up. She could have told the real story 100 times over. But she didn't. She chose silence, and for nearly half a century that silence protected people who had no business being protected. Now, at 80 years old, Priscilla has finally decided she's done. What she revealed recently isn't another tearful tribute to the king of rock and roll. This isn't about his music, his movies, or his legendary performances. This is about what actually happened inside Graceland on August 16, 1977, and more importantly, who was responsible for making sure Elvis Presley never walked out of that bathroom alive. Not directly, perhaps, but deliberately, according to Priscilla, absolutely. You have to understand something about Priscilla Presley. This is a woman who built an empire on discretion. After Elvis died, she could have sold every secret, every scandal, every dark moment to the highest bidder. The tabloids would have paid millions. The publishers would have begged. She had enough material to destroy reputations, end careers, and burn Graceland to the ground with nothing but the truth. Instead, she protected the legacy. She protected Lisa Marie. And she protected people who were standing in the shadows when Elvis took his last breath, people who heard him struggling and did absolutely nothing. That protection ended the moment her daughter died. When Lisa Marie Presley passed away in January 2023, something inside Priscilla shifted permanently. The grief was unbearable, but it was also clarifying. Suddenly, the reason she had stayed quiet for so long didn't matter anymore. Lisa Marie was the reason for the silence. She was the reason Priscilla swallowed her rage every time she saw Dr. Nick give another interview, every time Colonel Tom Parker was described as a genius manager, every time some documentary painted Elvis's death as an unfortunate accident caused by a troubled man who couldn't handle fame. Lisa Marie needed her father's memory to stay sacred. She needed the myth to stay intact. And Priscilla, as any mother would, gave her daughter exactly what she needed. But Lisa Marie is gone now. And Priscilla Presley has decided that the truth deserves to breathe. Let's go back to that day, August 16, 1977. The official story has been repeated so many times that it feels like scripture. Elvis was found unresponsive in his bathroom at Graceland. Paramedics were called. Resuscitation attempts failed. The king was pronounced dead at Baptist Memorial Hospital. Cause of death? Cardiac arrhythmia complicated by his prescription drug use. Tragic, but not suspicious. A cautionary tale about excess. Except that's not what Priscilla saw when she arrived at Graceland that day. She saw chaos, yes. She saw grief, yes. But she also saw something else. She saw people moving too quickly, whispering too quietly, coordinating stories before the police had even finished their initial assessment. She saw items being removed from the house. She saw phone calls being made that had nothing to do with mourning and everything to do with damage control. At the time, she was too devastated to process what she was witnessing. It was only later, in the weeks and months after the funeral, that the pieces started coming together. Staff members who wouldn't meet her eyes, friends who suddenly became unreachable. Stories that changed depending on who was telling them and who was listening. The official narrative was being constructed right in front of her, and Priscilla was expected to play along. For Lisa Marie's sake, she did. For 47 years, she did. But what she knows and what she has finally started sharing paints a picture of that night that is far darker than anything the public has ever been told. This wasn't a simple overdose. This wasn't Elvis losing a battle with his demons in private. According to Priscilla, there were people in that house who knew something was wrong hours before anyone called for help. There were people who heard sounds from that bathroom and made a choice. Not the choice to intervene, not the choice to save him, the choice to wait. Why would anyone make that choice? Who would benefit from Elvis Presley dying alone on that bathroom floor while help stood just on the other side of the door? That's exactly what Priscilla is finally ready to answer. But before we get to the names she's pointing fingers at, you need to understand just how deep the rot went inside Elvis's world. You need to understand who was feeding off him, who was draining him, and who needed him too incapacitated to ever realize what was happening. Because what Priscilla revealed about Elvis's inner circle will change everything you thought you knew about the people the king trusted most. By 1977, Graceland wasn't a home anymore. It was a cage dressed up in velvet and gold. And the people inside it weren't family. They were feeders. That's not speculation. That's the picture Priscilla Presley has spent decades quietly assembling, and it's the picture she's now willing to show the world. Start with the man at the top. Colonel Tom Parker, the so-called genius who guided Elvis's career from truck driver to cultural icon. History has been strangely kind to Parker, painting him as a shrewd businessman who maybe pushed a little too hard. But Priscilla doesn't see it that way. She never did. To her, Parker was a parasite with a gambling addiction so severe that he needed Elvis performing constantly just to cover his own debts. We're talking about a man who booked Elvis into grueling Las Vegas residencies and back-to-back touring schedules, not because Elvis wanted to perform, but because Parker owed millions to casino operators, and Elvis's sweat was the only currency he had. Elvis was exhausted. His body was failing. Doctors had warned him privately that the pace was unsustainable. But every time Elvis talked about slowing down, about taking a break, about maybe going to Europe or doing something different, Parker shut it down. No international tours because Parker, an illegal immigrant from the Netherlands, couldn't risk passport scrutiny. No breaks because the money had to keep flowing. No creative freedom because Parker had already sold the rights to nearly everything Elvis would ever produce. The Colonel didn't manage Elvis's career, he consumed it. And according to Priscilla, he consumed the man right along with it. Then there was the Memphis Mafia, Elvis's inner circle, his boys, the guys who rode with him, partied with him, and swore they'd take a bullet for him. Priscilla knew every single one of them. She lived with them, ate with them, watched them orbit Elvis like planets around a dying sun. And she'll tell you now what she couldn't say then. They weren't protecting Elvis. They were protecting their access to Elvis. There's a devastating difference. Every one of those men had their lifestyle funded entirely by Elvis's generosity. Houses, cars, jewelry, cash. The moment any of them challenged him, confronted him about the pills, or pushed back against the downward spiral, they risked losing everything. So they didn't push back, they watched, they enabled. They handed him water to wash down whatever Dr. Nick had prescribed that day and told themselves they were being loyal. Dr. George Nicopolis, Dr. Nick. This is where Priscilla's voice changes when she speaks. This is where the carefully controlled composure cracks just slightly. Over 10,000 prescriptions in the final 20 months of Elvis's life. Uppers to get him on stage, downers to pull him off it. Painkillers layered on top of sedatives, layered on top of stimulants, in combinations that no responsible physician would ever authorize. Priscilla has always believed that Dr. Nick wasn't treating Elvis, he was managing a product. Keeping the machine running just well enough to perform, just sedated enough to stay compliant, and just dependent enough to never question why he needed a doctor by his side 24 hours a day. And then there was Ginger Alden, Elvis's girlfriend at the time of his death, the woman who was in that house the night everything ended. Priscilla has been remarkably restrained about Ginger over the years. Almost too restrained. The kind of silence that speaks louder than any accusation ever could. What Priscilla has recently hinted at, without naming Ginger directly, is that the people closest to Elvis that night failed him in ways that went beyond negligence. There were hours unaccounted for. There were delays that didn't make sense. There were decisions made in those final moments that prioritized panic and self-preservation over the life of a man lying on a bathroom floor. Every single person in Elvis's orbit had a reason to keep him exactly where he was. Drugged, dependent, performing, and paying. Nobody had an incentive to save him. And that, according to Priscilla, is the real cause of death. Not a heart attack, not an overdose. A system designed to extract everything Elvis had until there was nothing left to take. But here's what makes this story truly devastating. There was one final phone call between Elvis and Priscilla just days before he died, and what he said in that conversation haunts her to this very day. A few days before August 16, 1977, Priscilla Presley's phone rang. It was Elvis. She could tell immediately something was different. This wasn't the Elvis who called to talk about Lisa Marie's school or to reminisce about old times with that familiar warmth in his voice. This Elvis sounded hollow, distant, like a man standing at the edge of something and looking down. He told her he was tired, not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, the kind of tired that settles into your bones and makes you question whether any of it is worth continuing. He talked about the upcoming tour like it was a prison sentence. He talked about the people around him like they were strangers wearing familiar faces. And then he said something that Priscilla has carried like a stone in her chest for nearly 5 decades. He said he didn't think he could do this anymore. Not the music, not the fame, any of it. Priscilla tried to comfort him. She tried to reach through the phone and pull him back from whatever dark place he was sinking into. But there was a resignation in his voice that terrified her. This wasn't Elvis being dramatic. This was Elvis being honest, maybe for the first time in years. She wanted to go to him. She considered driving to Graceland that very night. But their relationship was complicated. They were divorced. There were boundaries now, unspoken rules about how close she could get before someone in his circle shut the door. She told herself she would call again the next day. She told herself there was still time. There wasn't. August 16th unfolded like a nightmare in slow motion. Elvis had been up most of the night, unable to sleep despite the pharmacy coursing through his bloodstream. He played racquetball with his cousin around 3 in the morning, something he often did when the insomnia became unbearable. By early morning, he retreated to his bedroom suite. Ginger Alden was there. According to the official account, Elvis told her he was going into the bathroom to read, and she fell back asleep. What happened over the next several hours remains the darkest mystery in rock and roll history. When Ginger finally found Elvis on the bathroom floor, it was mid-afternoon. He had been down for hours. His body was already showing signs that resuscitation would be futile. But here's where Priscilla's version departs sharply from the official timeline. She has long believed that people inside Graceland knew something was wrong long before Ginger raised the alarm. Staff members who were awake, people moving through the house, sounds that were heard and ignored. She doesn't claim anyone stood over Elvis and watched him die. What she claims is far more chilling. She believes the culture inside that house had become so broken, so conditioned to look the other way, that nobody thought to check on a man who had been locked in a bathroom for hours while barely clinging to life. And then came the aftermath. Priscilla arrived at Graceland to find a scene that didn't match the story being told. Phone calls had been made before paramedics arrived, not to doctors, not to family, to lawyers, to managers, to people whose first instinct wasn't grief but containment. Items were moved from Elvis's bedroom. Pill bottles were gathered. Conversations were had in hushed tones behind closed doors while Elvis's body was still being transported to the hospital. The autopsy added another layer of darkness. The full toxicology results were sealed by the Presley family for 50 years. At the time, Priscilla supported that decision because Lisa Marie was only 9 years old and didn't deserve to grow up under the shadow of whatever those results contained. But now Priscilla questions whether that secrecy served her daughter or simply shielded the people who contributed to Elvis's destruction. The official cause of death was cardiac arrhythmia. Clean, simple, almost respectable. But everyone in that inner circle knew the truth was far uglier, far more complicated, and far more damning than a heart that simply stopped. For decades, Priscilla accepted the official story publicly while privately wrestling with a fury that never dimmed. But losing Lisa Marie burned away the last barrier between her silence and the truth she's now ready to unleash. And what she said next shocked everyone. January 12, 2023 broke Priscilla Presley in a way that nothing else ever could. Not the divorce, not Elvis's death, not the decades of watching his legacy get carved up and commodified by people who never loved him the way she did. Losing Lisa Marie was different. It was the kind of loss that doesn't just take someone from you. It takes the reason you've been holding yourself together. And when that reason disappears, so do all the walls you built around every secret you ever swore to keep. The legal battles came fast. Suddenly, Priscilla found herself fighting over the Presley estate, navigating accusations and courtroom drama while still burying her only daughter. People she thought were allies revealed themselves as opportunists. Trust collapsed in every direction. And somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, Priscilla arrived at a realization that changed everything. She had spent 47 years protecting a version of history that protected the wrong people. She had stayed silent for Lisa Marie. Lisa Marie was gone. The silence no longer served anyone except the people who deserved to be exposed, so she started talking. Not to tabloids, not for money, but in private conversations, interviews, and moments of raw honesty that have slowly filtered into the public consciousness. And what she's saying is devastating. Priscilla now believes without hesitation that Elvis Presley's death was not an accident. She's not calling it murder, she's calling it something almost worse. Deliberate, calculated, sustained negligence by people who understood exactly what was happening and chose to let it continue because Elvis alive and suffering was more profitable than Elvis healthy and free. Every pill Dr. Nick prescribed kept Elvis dependent and compliant. Every tour Colonel Parker booked drained another month of life from a man who was begging to rest. Every member of the Memphis Mafia who looked the other way when Elvis stumbled through a room barely conscious made a choice that prioritized their paycheck over his survival. Priscilla isn't guessing at this. She lived it. She watched it happen from the outside after the divorce, powerless to intervene because the very people destroying Elvis had convinced him that she was the enemy. That's the part that breaks her voice when she speaks about it. Not just that Elvis died, but that they isolated him so completely that the one person who might have saved him couldn't get close enough to try. Priscilla believes that if she had still been in that house, still been his wife, still had the authority to fire doctors and dismiss hangers-on and drag Elvis to a real hospital, he would have survived. Maybe not forever, maybe not without scars, but he would have had a chance. They took that chance away from him. And they took it away from her. There's a guilt in Priscilla's words that is almost unbearable to hear. She wonders if leaving Elvis sealed his fate. She questions whether her own freedom came at the cost of his life. Rationally, she knows the divorce wasn't the cause. She knows the machinery that killed Elvis was already in motion long before she packed her bags. But grief isn't rational. And at 80 years old, looking back at the wreckage of a family that has now lost both Elvis and Lisa Marie, Priscilla allows herself to sit with that guilt in a way she never did before. What she wants now is simple but radical. She wants the world to stop worshiping Elvis the product and start mourning Elvis the person. The father who adored Lisa Marie beyond all reason. The son who never recovered from losing his mother Gladys. The man who sang with more soul than anyone who ever lived but couldn't find a single person honest enough to tell him the truth when it mattered most. Priscilla wants that Elvis to be remembered, not the jumpsuit, not the Vegas spectacle, not the tabloid tragedy. The human being who was devoured by an industry that saw him as nothing more than a revenue stream with a heartbeat. At 80 years old, Priscilla Presley is not seeking revenge. She's seeking release. She carried their secrets long enough. She protected their names long enough. She played the role of the gracious ex-wife long enough. Now she's speaking as the woman who loved Elvis before the world ever heard him sing. And she's done carrying the weight of their sins. If this story hit you the way it hit us, subscribe to this channel right now. Drop a comment telling us what you think really happened to Elvis. Share this video with someone who needs to hear the truth. New stories like this drop every single week, And trust me, you do not want to miss what's coming next.